Welcome to Thrive with Kirsty, the relatable women's coaching podcast that helps you thrive wherever you are in your life. I'm Kirsty from Kirsty Robson Coaching, and today we're talking about self-criticism. Why are we so hard on ourselves? Why are we so mean to ourselves? Why do we expect perfection from ourselves and no one else? Have you ever noticed how mean women can be? Not to each other, but to ourselves. I'm talking about that horrible inner critic voice that likes to point out every single mistake you've ever made. I don't know about you, but I have said things to myself that I would never say to another human being. Like if I said those things to my friends, I wouldn't have any friends. You might think that being hard on yourself is somehow motivating, that if you're not constantly criticizing yourself, that you're going to become lazy or complacent. But if no one has told you this explicitly, let me be the one to say being hard on yourself is not going to make you better. It's just going to make you feel tired and sad. What actually creates change is compassion and kindness towards yourself, talking to yourself like you're somebody you actually like. Revolutionary concept, I know. I used to be a queen of self-criticism. I was so hard on myself. I used to make all of my mistakes a huge deal. I used to berate myself for the smallest things. I would replay conversations over and over in my mind, thinking, why did I say that thing that was weird? Or that person didn't get the joke that I was making. Now they're going to think I'm odd, or just little things like that. I wouldn't just think about them once. I would go over and over and over in my mind for days or weeks or even months. I would be thinking about those things as I went to sleep. So I would be trying to sleep and my brain would be reliving all of the mistakes I'd ever made and all of the weird things I'd said, or all of the conversations that didn't quite land the way I was expecting them to. And I would take responsibility for things that weren't even my fault because I was so used to criticizing myself. And that habit of taking responsibility for things that weren't my fault has caused some serious issues in my life. And it really impacted my mental health at one point as well. To give you a little bit of backstory as to where my self-criticism comes from, in particular, I'm going to be talking about my childhood and I'm going to be mentioning abuse very briefly. So if you don't want to hear this, then please skip ahead a minute. And if you do decide to listen to this, please do take care. I grew up with an abusive family member, and that family member used to tell me that everything was my fault. I used to get blamed for things that I had zero to do with. I wasn't even in the room when these things happened, but somehow it was all my fault that this random thing happened. That person used to convince me to take responsibility for things that weren't my fault. And because the abuse that I suffered was physical and emotional abuse, I became so used to taking responsibility for things, blaming myself, and picking apart every little thing. I was told some awful things about myself, some really horrible things about myself. And because they were the result of, quite often physical abuse, they were said to me after the physical abuse, I used to just take it all on board because you're in quite an emotionally vulnerable state at that point. And so I took all of this on and I believed it. And I used to criticize myself incessantly. I used to believe that no one was really my friend, that they didn't want to be my friend. They were just doing it because they pitied me. I used to believe that, if it wasn't sunny today, that was somehow my fault because I did something yesterday and, the universe is punishing me. I mean, the level of delusion, really, when I reflect on it now, is kind of intense. But I recognize those things because it is all part of my story. And the only reason I'm mentioning this to you now is that I had such a journey. Such a huge journey from going from where I was to where I am now. And that is not to say that I am completely free of self-blame and self-criticism, because it's just not the case. It's not perfect. But I'm much better at recognizing the patterns, and understanding where it comes from has been super, super helpful for me because I can call it out. And now I recognize when I hear the self-criticism in my voice, I can hear the voice of that family member and recognize that that came from them and it's not me. Although I will say I've been doing this work for so long now that it's very rare that that person's voice ever enters my head, which is the goal. I never wanted that person to have any power over the way I feel. And luckily now that's just not the case anymore. Understanding where it came from was crucial for me because then I can name it, recognize it, understand it, and decide that it's not something I want in my life and it's not something I want in my brain. Please remember that if you don't have a story like that, and I certainly hope that's the case for most, if not all of you, that doesn't make your experience of self-criticism any less valid. Everybody's experience of the way that they feel and the way they think is their own. Sometimes I am just self-critical because I'm really hard on myself sometimes. And that's not related to, my experiences as a child. I'm hard on myself because if I'm really passionate about something, I want to do my very, very best. And that applies with my coaching. That applies with this podcast. That applies with how good of a friend I am. I recently had an example where I made a bit of a mistake. It turns out it wasn't a mistake at all. I totally misunderstood. And I was beating myself up for no reason. But my friend said to me, "You're too hard on yourself. You're way too hard on yourself." And I was like, "Yeah, I am." And that's my friend Esther. And she's that friend who will call you out on stuff that is not good for you. And thank goodness she does, because sometimes I get caught up still in the self-criticism loop. And having a friend that calls you out on that's not helping you. You don't need to do that, is so valuable for me. So I hope that you have a friend like that in your life. But I literally ruminated on, and isn't that just a classic example of we make things so much worse in our head sometimes? And the reason I'm telling you this is I'm sure there's going to be people thinking, well, you're a coach. Why are you doing this? Like, surely you should know this stuff by now. Coaches are still human. And yes, I have all of these tools, but sometimes it's hard to be 100% objective with yourself, even as a coach. Therapists have therapists, coaches have coaches, right? We all need that person to help us see things outside of ourselves. And I do have some amazing friends that are able to help me in that respect and give me a different perspective. But I digress. That self-criticism did absolutely nothing for me. It didn't serve me in any way. If I'm thinking about how I want to show up as a friend, how I want to show up in my life, then there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. The wrong way, which is beating yourself up and berating yourself and criticizing yourself and being really hard on yourself, is not the way that you make lasting change. Before we go into the tools that we can use to start to move from self-criticism to self-compassion, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we as women experience self-criticism more and why we're so hard on ourselves. Whilst everyone experiences self-doubt and self-criticism, there are some societal and biological changes and factors that impact women more than men or other genders. From a young age, girls are praised for being things like polite and neat and tidy and quiet, and boys are praised for being messy and loud and brave. And that fosters a mindset in us sometimes that if we deviate from the roles that we're expected to have as children, that's not a lesson learned or a mistake or a learning opportunity, but it's somehow a loss of value. And this applies to boys as well. I mean, if you have a boy who is quiet and more feminine and likes to play with dolls, there is still a societal expectation that that boy needs to change or something needs to change because that's not, quote, normal. And the same applies for girls. If we are loud and rambunctious and we like to, swing on the monkey bars and get muddy and dirty and climb trees, that we're an outlier. And society is literally telling us you don't fit the role that you're supposed to have. And when you hear that message often, you feel like I'm not what I should be, and you start to look inwards and you start to criticize yourself, or you can start to look inwards and criticize yourself. And also, let's think about the roles that we're expected to play when we're older. So if you are a woman who has a career and a family, and by family, I mean your own children and a partner, the chances are you're expected to excel both in your career. And we all know that as women, we have to work harder to get the same pay and recognition that men get because of the gender pay gap and the gender gap in our workplaces. But you're also expected to excel in your home life and your family life as well. And we also know that women are typically the ones that carry more mental load in the family. So most of the time, the vast majority of the time, it will be the woman who holds the mental load of who has got what appointment at the doctor's, who needs to go to football practice after school, who needs to go to a dance class, who needs to go to so-and-so's house for a play date. Where we see examples of men attempting to carry the same mental load, their reflection is often still on women, right? A partner might say, "I'll go to the shop. What do we need?" So although he's volunteering to take on that task, the woman is still expected to hold the mental load of knowing what food is in the cupboard, what food is in the fridge, what is missing, and what are we going to need for the weekly shop coming up? What are we going to be eating for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? So the responsibility, the mental load is still on the woman. So is it any wonder when you're trying to shoot at two moving targets, you feel like you're missing them? Typically, when we're looking back decades, women predominantly were homemakers and stayed in the home. They didn't have to think about careers and family life. Their focus was family life. The husband's focus was careers. Whereas women are now predominantly, and the majority of women who have families are also working in a job, you now are expected to take on two roles. It's not an equal division of mental load or of labor. So yes, of course, you're going to feel like you're failing, because I don't think humans are designed to carry so much in their minds and to be perfect all the time. It's just not possible. If you don't have a partner that carries an equal mental load, you are taking on more than you've ever been expected to take on as a woman before. And of course, that's going to feel like you're missing the mark. And because you see examples on social media where, this so-and-so looks like they've got the perfect family life and everything's organized and the kids are perfectly behaved and the house is always perfect and there's no mess and there's home-cooked meals. Every single meal is a perfectly home-cooked meal. We will see examples of that on social media, and of course it's going to make us feel like we're failing. So you can't help but look inwards and think, what is wrong with me? Why am I not able to do the same? And we don't know their real life. And this leads me on to another point as well, that social media, we all know, is a highlight reel. When I post on social media, I have my hair and my makeup done. I'm wearing a somewhat decent outfit. Most of the time when I'm at home, I'm not wearing makeup. Haven't got my hair done, and I'm quite often in slouchy clothes, right? Or if I'm on a work call, might not be. But I don't post myself in my pajamas with no makeup and my hair looking a mess. So as much as I want to be real, everybody is presenting a somewhat heightened version of themselves. And we all know this, right? We all know this. I'm not the first person to talk about this. But I do feel like that really impacts how we view ourselves, that you can't help but look inwards. When I see somebody who posts in elegant outfits every day, knowing that half the time I'm in my slouchies, I can't help but think, there's a part of me that's like, maybe I should be wearing more professional clothing, even just during that, in the house. Maybe I should be, dressing up all the time. That self-criticism, that looking inwards, it all stems from comparison. And social media is the worst part because it faces right in front of us a comparison version of ourselves through hundreds of thousands of different videos that we see online that we can't help but compare ourselves to. When you compare, you are very much prone to then self-critique. And this also applies to the way that women are scrutinized on a microscopic level, whether we're talking about their bodies or their behaviors. We know that there is a double standard in society. When a man ages, he is a silver fox. When a woman ages, she is letting herself go. When a man is juggling a career and a family, no one asks him how he's coping with it all. When a woman does it, it's like, who's looking after your kids so that you can be here? All of this language that we hear, whether it be through other people, through media, through social media, all of this language gives us the story that we should be doing X, that we should be doing Y. There is an expectation on us. The language and the views throughout society is designed to put women in boxes, to put women in roles, to expect certain things from women. All of that fuels self-criticism. We can't help it. When there are expectations on us, we then look inwards, we then compare to the ideals of what we're supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to be like, and then the meanness and the unkindness towards ourselves, the self-criticism invariably starts. And another thing I want to talk about here is the confidence gap. And the most classic example of a confidence gap is with job adverts. When a job is advertised, men tend to apply when they meet around 60% of the criteria of that job advert, whereas women will wait until they are at 100% or very close to 100% before they apply. And this reinforces the idea that more is expected from us as women. We also know that women are statistically more likely to have their qualifications and their experience criticized and questioned. And therefore, we sort of develop a bit of a preemptive strike when it comes to self-criticism. And that leads me on to the idea that women often employ a sort of preemptive strike self-criticism as a defense mechanism. We know that if we criticize ourselves first, we get in there before somebody else can do it, and therefore it's not as impactful to us, and it's not as much of a surprise if somebody makes that criticism of us. If somebody to make that criticism of you, you've already done it for yourself. It's not going to be a surprise, and it's not going to have as much impact. And that can apply to anything. If you criticize your own body, if you criticize your life choices, if you criticize, I don't know, your lifestyle habits, for example. If I criticize myself first, if somebody else were to make this criticism, it's not going to have as much of an impact on me because I've already done it. And you can't upset me because I've already thought this about myself. When I think about how self-critical I was and the work that I've done to get to where I am now, there is no one moment where I thought this has got to stop. I don't look back on it and think I really beat myself up over something and it had X impact on me. I think what really drove my desire to change is the amount that other people started noticing and commenting on how critical I was of myself. My friends started to say, "Why are you apologizing for that? Why are you taking responsibility for that? You didn't do anything towards that. That's got nothing to do with you." It was the level or the amount, the frequency of people bringing this up that made me really aware of it. And then I started to move into a few different techniques that I would use to stop myself being so self-critical and changing those thoughts from criticisms into opportunities for growth and lessons learned. And there's a really important distinction. And the difference between those two is self-criticism is mean, it's harsh, it's berating you. And lessons learned is all about being kind to yourself, being calmly reflective, and then deciding which course of action you would like to take instead moving forward. I would like to invite you to please give yourself some compassion. I don't believe that anybody sets out in their lives deciding they're just going to be really mean to themselves. These are learned behaviors and they're also influenced by external factors. The first thing you can do is just to be aware of it. I want to talk a little bit about self-criticism being a form of motivation. I've had this question before in coaching, which was, if I stop being hard on myself, won't I just stop trying? Won't I just stop trying to be better? And I understand why it feels that way. We've been taught that criticism is motivating, that we need to be tough on ourselves in order to get anywhere, that by being mean to ourselves, that's how we really create change. But let me ask you something. Has being mean to yourself ever actually made your life better? Has all that self-criticism helped you achieve your goals? Made you happier or more confident? Or has it just made you feel rubbish while you're doing that thing anyway? I achieve way more when I'm being kind to myself. When I'm not wasting all my energy beating myself up, I can actually use that energy to make the change that I want or to do the thing that I'm trying to do. Motivation from shame is exhausting and unsustainable. You can't hate yourself to lasting change. Motivation from self-compassion, that's what really lasts. So no, being kind to yourself won't make you lazy or complacent. It will make you successful in the long term. And with that said, let's talk about some of the most successful strategies to take you from self-criticism to self-compassion. And the first one I want to talk about is the best friend filter. Now, this is probably the most impactful tool that I used because we know we say things to ourselves we would never say to anyone else, and we certainly would not say those things to our best friend. And that is a really good place to start in terms of how we speak to ourselves, how kind or how harsh we are to ourselves. The first thing I'd like you to do is when you notice a harsh thought, stop and ask yourself, would I say that to my best friend? If the answer is no, reframe that thought with compassion. Let's say, for example, you were thinking, oh my gosh, I'm so stupid. Why did I do that? Would I say that to my best friend? Absolutely not. I would not tell my best friend she was stupid and berate her for doing X, Y, and Z. So the reframe I would say is, I'm human. I made a mistake. And next time I'm presented with that situation, I would like to do this differently by doing, and then name the thing that you would do differently. The second tool we're going to use is to give your inner critic voice a silly name. Now, I know this sounds bizarre, but please bear with me because this actually creates a bit of fun and also takes away the power of your inner voice. As we know, our inner critic can often have its own voice. And as I mentioned earlier, my inner critic used to have the voice of my family member. Having its own voice and having its own identity gives it too much power. So to weaken this, we want to give it a name that is silly and ridiculous. And every time your inner critic has something to say, you name it with that silly name. So, for example, you could call your inner critic the grump. What you can do is to name the inner critic and say, oh, the grump has got something to say about this. The grump thinks I'm doing this, or the grump thinks I'm doing that. Not only does it weaken its power by making it silly, it also creates a bit of distance from you and that thought. So say, for example, we'll go back to the earlier example of saying, I'm so stupid. Why did I do that? You could say, oh, the grump is telling me that I'm stupid. The grump is asking why I did that. It creates a distance between you and the thought that you're having. And at that distance allows you to observe the thought without being consumed by it. And observing the thought without immediately taking it on is a really effective way to distance yourself from it, observe it, and from that place of observation, you can then decide, actually, what would I like to do differently? So your brain will naturally start to, when you identify it as something silly, as you identify it as something you don't want, your brain will naturally start to think of solutions to that and start to reframe it for you. Having said that, our third tool that we're going to use to help reframe self-criticism to self-compassion is going to help your brain to do some of that reframing. And we're going to move from what I refer to as sort of emotional language to logical language. Your inner critic is all about emotional language, and that emotional language often reflects on your self-worth. So to beat it, we're going to use logical language, which focuses on objective thinking rather than subjective thinking. Let's use an example of you missed a deadline at work, and your emotional thinking might be saying, oh my gosh, I'm such an idiot, I missed that deadline. I'm terrible at my job. The logical thinking might say, I missed that deadline at work because I took on too much. Next time I'm presented with that situation, I'll set a reminder for the deadline that's earlier than it needs to be, or I'll decide not to take on so much, whatever it might be, whatever your action is. The difference between those two thoughts is huge. Because not only are you showing yourself self-compassion, that there is no blame in the logical thinking, there's no reflection of your worth, and there's no emotive language, but it also focuses on where that lesson needs to be learned. Okay, so I took on too much, that's why I missed my work deadline. And by focusing on the lesson, not only do you change the language away from being self-critical, but you're also helping to learn how to avoid that situation in the future. And therefore, there's a huge amount of growth that comes with a thought like that, versus just berating yourself. Fourth tool we're going to talk about is interrupting the pattern, the loop that your brain is stuck on. Women are statistically more likely to ruminate. That's playing the mistake over and over and over in their minds. I sometimes refer to negative thinking as being in a negative spin cycle, as in your thought is in a washing machine that is your brain, and the thought is being spun round and round and round in your mind. And it just helps me to visualize my negative thought as being in a washing machine, as being in a negative spin cycle. And the best way to interrupt that negative spin cycle is to physically move. I mean, when you catch yourself replaying a cringy thought in your mind or replaying a conversation that you had, physically move, physically change your environment. So get up, drink a glass of water, do some stretching, do some jumping jacks, jog on the spot, just wander around your room, whatever it is. But physically move, physically change from staying still and replaying the thought over and over in your mind. And next up in our tool list is the 5-year rule. When you catch yourself replaying something in your mind, ask yourself, will this matter to me in 5 years' time? Will it matter to me in 5 months or 5 days? If the answer is no, it does not deserve your energy right now. And lastly, what I'd like to invite you to think about is the input you have in your life that might be fueling your comparison and self-criticism. Are you looking at social media content which causes you to constantly compare yourself to this so-called projected perfect idea that you're seeing on social media? Is there an account that you see on social media where every time they post something, you think, I'm not doing X or I'm not doing Y or I don't look like that? If that is the case, consider unfollowing those accounts that trigger feelings of inadequacy or not being enough, because naturally they will lead to comparison and then self-criticism. And lastly, this is something I ask all of my clients to do, and I always end a session on a positive, and that is to talk about celebrating your wins. And it doesn't matter how small your wins are, we still want to celebrate them. You can do this by doing something I call having a praise folder. It's also known as a win list for some people. Every time you get some positive feedback, you get a testimonial, you get a glowing review from a client or from a colleague or a friend, or anytime you get some kind of positive feedback or a compliment, you keep it in a folder, either in your desktop or a physical folder, or you can even have a win list on your phone or a written list. So you can write down all of the positive feedback and all of the compliments that you've gotten. And it doesn't matter how small that is, right? There is no such thing as that task being too small. If you made the perfect cup of coffee, put that on your win list. I know that it sounds trivial. I know that it sounds silly, but every time you do something well, make sure you note it. What this does is it trains your brain to look for evidence of your competence rather than looking for evidence of your flaws. And remember, self-compassion is a muscle. It might feel silly and cringy at first, but I promise you, the more you do it, the easier it gets. Your brain believes the story you tell it the most often. Remember that spin cycle I was referring to? Your brain will spin those thoughts regardless of whether they're positive or negative. So make sure you're focusing on the right things. Make sure the story you tell your brain is a positive one. Now it's time for the Kirsty Coaching Challenge. Now, this is something I'm introducing to each podcast episode, and it's a small task or action or challenge that you can take to reinforce the message that we've discussed in this episode. And today, I want you to write one sentence or a paragraph that you will say to yourself when you're being critical of yourself. Write something that's personal to you, not something generic. I'm going to share mine with you as an example. I've written a paragraph, but you can write a sentence or whatever feels right to you. This is what I've been telling myself this week when I've been tempted to be self-critical. You're invested because you care so much, and that's a good thing. Kindness is the difference between lessons and criticism, and the lessons make me better, more confident, and more successful than before. Kindness will help me grow, not criticism. I am more than enough, and I am smashing it. It's okay not to be perfect all the time. I am perfectly imperfect, just as I am. So give that a try. Write yourself a sentence this week, and every time you catch yourself being self-critical, use the tools that I've referred to, and then finish with that sentence that helps remind you that being self-critical doesn't serve you, that kindness and compassion to yourself will serve you tremendously. Thank you so much for joining this episode of Thrive with Kirsty. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. New episodes come out every Monday. You can find me on Instagram, Threads, YouTube, and TikTok at Kirsty Robson Coaching. And you can find the Thrive with Kirsty podcast Instagram at Thrive with Kirsty podcast. And lastly, ladies, I'm hosting a women's retreat in Sussex this October, and it is a beautiful long weekend escape for women who are ready to stop putting themselves last. If you've been feeling burnt out, disconnected from yourself, or craving something more, this is for you. Over 3 days, you'll experience coaching sessions designed to help you reconnect with who you truly are. Meaningful conversations with women who truly get it. Walks and yoga by the beach, journaling, and moments of real connection with a gorgeous community of women. We'll cover topics like today's episode and much, much more. I'll drop a link in the show notes for those that want to learn more. Go follow me on socials, send me your thoughts and opinions on today's topic, and you never know, I might be reading those out in a future episode. And come back next week for another episode of Thrive with Kirsty.